Welcome to BCM. We finish up Nehemiah tonight. We finish up our time together for this semester when our student leaders met before the semester and landed on the theme of resurgence, of trying to thrive instead of survive in this season that we're in right now. I really felt like Nehemiah would give us a good framework, a good foundation to see important ideas and themes and godly principles. I'm not sure that I fully realized just how timely and relevant it would be. I'm not sure I realized how much I would personally benefit from walking through this book and going through it during this time of uncertainty when we're doing things so differently than we've done them before. I hope that you have also benefited from walking through this book together. And each week, as we have gone through it, over the past 12 weeks, we've seen one big idea that can help us experience a resurgence in our lives and in our faith. Last week, the big idea was this: we will experience a resurgence in our walk with Jesus when we turn to Him and pray with confidence, humility, and power. Confidence in who God is and what God has done. In humility, an understanding of our own sinfulness and the realization that we have fallen short of God's standard of holiness and righteousness. And we are completely dependent on God for grace and for mercy and for His provision to be poured out on us. And we pray in power, trusting that God is able, that He can provide, that He is who He says He is. And so as we look at that last week, we turn this week to a big idea that says this: we will experience a resurgence in our walk with Jesus when we give thanks and glorify His name, and then continue to walk in faith and obedience. We're going to experience resurgence in our walk with Jesus when we give thanks, when we glorify His name, and then as we continue to walk in faith and obedience, recognizing that it's not just the things that we say, it's how that then translates into action, into how we live our lives. And so think back to what we've seen so far in the book of Nehemiah. Just to recap, if you've been here just a couple of weeks or if you've been with us for the entire 12 weeks, Nehemiah, when the story begins, is in the palace of the king of Persia, and he is the cupbearer, which is a position of great responsibility and prestige and privilege. And so Nehemiah is in that place when some people come to him from about 1,000 miles away in Jerusalem. He's in modern-day Iraq, and he's a long way from Jerusalem and God's people there. And they tell him that the city of Jerusalem, God's city, is in ruins. And instead of just saying, well, that's too bad, or I'm sorry to hear about that, Nehemiah is moved by this, and he has a concern for their need, and he's going to take the initiative because he has a willingness to act, and he's going to fall to his knees in prayer, and he's going to put together a plan, and he's going to see that play out over the course of time, because he sees that not only does a city lying in ruins means that the people of God are vulnerable, but also that the glory of God has been compromised. And so what Nehemiah wants to see, and the reason this moves him to tears and then to prayer, is because he wants to see the God he serves receive the glory he is due. Because the nations around would have ridiculed the people, as they did, and mocked the people, which they did, because their God that they worshiped was not taking care of them. So you have these polytheistic nations who are worshiping multiple gods, looking at the God of Israel, or at the people of Israel, and at the God they're serving, and they're saying, what kind of God do you serve, that He can't even take care of providing you with something as basic as a wall around the city to protect you? So not only was Nehemiah's concern with the well-being of God's people, he was concerned with the glory of God's name, and he wanted to see the God that he served receive the glory that he was due. And so he goes to the king courageously and says to him, here's what I need to go. Will you endorse this trip, and will you provide for me to do it? And so the king sends him on his way, because Nehemiah has had favor with the king, and because, as he has said, God granted him success, so that God has entrusted to Nehemiah this responsibility of going back to Jerusalem. And so he goes back 1,000 miles away, and he begins the process of rebuilding this wall. He gets on a horse and he rides around the city, defining reality and saying, this is what it looks like, this is what has to be done, and here's how we're going to go about it. He faces opposition from the very beginning, people telling him it can't be done, you can't do it, God won't do it, and you're going to be a failure in this, and we're going to make sure that you don't complete this wall. You people are not up to this task, is basically what his critics were saying to them. And so Nehemiah, as he guides and shepherds his people through this time, as they face discouragement and disappointment because things aren't going as well as they had hoped, or as fast as they had hoped, or maybe they had unrealistic expectations about how quickly things could get back to normal, Nehemiah has to face that and deal with that and lead through that. And as he does so, he constantly turns to God in prayer and asks that God would grant them success, because he wants to see God's name restored. And so he puts together this plan, and he has this course of action that he sends them on, and we see this incredible thing take place, that even in the midst of opposition and trial and struggle and disappointment and discouragement, that he sees in 52 days they face injustice around them, criticism around them, and in 52 days they complete this wall that has been down for 150 years. So this wall is now completed, and Nehemiah begins to call the people together. And they read the word, as we've looked at over the course of the last couple of weeks. They read the word together, and they see what God expects of them, and they turn to him. And so now what we see as the book winds down is that Nehemiah looks back on all that has happened, and he says, it's time for us to give thanks. That's a timely message for us in this season that we're in right now. And so for Nehemiah, he's going to say, let's give thanks. It's time for us to celebrate. And so we pick up in Nehemiah chapter 12 as he's calling the people for the dedication of the wall and for them to celebrate. And he begins in verse 27. And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgivings, and with singing, with cymbals, harps, and lyres. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the districts surrounding Jerusalem and from the villages of the Netophathites, also from Beth Gilgal and from the region of Gabaa and Asmaveth, for the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem. And the priest and the Levites purified themselves, and they purified the people and the gates and the wall. Then I brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall and appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. One went to the south, and then he talks about who went and where they went and how many people went and the instruments that they took. And then skipping down to verse 38, he says, verse 38 says, the other choir, so he's got this one choir that goes up and they go south. The other choir of those who gave thanks, in verse 38, went to the north, and I followed them with half of the people on the wall above the tower of the ovens to the broad wall. And he goes on the same way, and he continues to tell who went this way. And they meet up around and they go into the temple. Verse 43, they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Get the picture here. 2 great choirs all the leaders, all the priests, all the people, Nehemiah says, we're going to celebrate. We're going to make a lot of noise. We are going to praise God, and we are going to give thanks. So the end of verse 43, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Now, check this out. They climbed up on the wall to do all this. They marched in opposite directions, and then they met at the temple of God. Now, why was that significant? Why was it significant? Why does Nehemiah say, we got up on the wall? Go back to chapter 4, and it says, when he first encounters the opposition and the critics, chapter 4, the first guys that come to him, one of the first things they say to him is, if even a small fox climbs up on that wall, it will destroy it. That wall's not even strong enough. It's not even structurally sound enough to have a small fox climb up on top of it, or the whole thing will collapse. Nehemiah is saying to the people around, to the critics, and even to the people who may have doubted within their community of faith, how do you like this? What do you think of us and our God now? You see, this is not ultimately about leaving you with the idea that Nehemiah is an awesome guy. Ultimately, this is about Nehemiah serving an awesome God, a God who is worthy of Nehemiah's praise and glory, a God who is worthy of having God's people climb up on a wall that critics said wouldn't hold up a small animal, and proclaiming long and loud that he is worthy of their thanks, worthy of their praise, and he is worthy of ours as well. The glory of God has been defined as his greatness, his beauty, and his worth on display. Think of the glory of God that way, that the glory of God is his greatness and his beauty and his worth on display. Now, what an unbelievable picture in Nehemiah 12 of his greatness and his beauty and his worth on display. Because the primary message of Nehemiah is not that a man can restore a wall. It's that a faithful and a promise-keeping God restores his people. And then having those people, moved by God, empowered by God, proclaim that God is sovereign and awesome and faithful and holy. That's the message of Nehemiah. That the one true living God keeps his promises to his people, and those people in turn can't help but to climb up on a wall or a mountaintop or the top of a parking garage or wherever they might be and proclaim to people everywhere that he is great and mighty and worthy of all praise and thanksgiving. And if the book of Nehemiah ended with chapter 12, it would end on a high note with people giving thanks and praise and glorifying God among the nations. But Nehemiah has 13 chapters, and chapter 13 comes along like the year 2020 to remind us that we don't live in a perfect world, and not every story has a fairy tale ending. And yet, even in imperfect situations, with imperfect people, God remains, and God sustains, and God restores, and God saves. But in chapter 13, the people fall back into old habits of apathy and disinterest and disobedience. It gets so bad at one point Nehemiah confronts some of the leaders, some of the people. He gets in a fight with them and he pulls out their hair. That's what it says in verse 25 of chapter 13. That's one of those descriptive passages. It just describes to us what happened. It's not prescriptive, telling us what we should do in similar circumstances. We won't read all of chapter 13. We get an idea of what's going on by reading beginning in verse 15, where it says, "In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." After all that God has done, miraculous ways in which He's worked, over time they drifted away, even in spite of all that they had seen, all that they had experienced, all that they had accomplished. That's a great reminder for us. You don't just drift into holiness. If you don't run toward Jesus or run with Him, you'll drift away from Him. You won't just drift into His will for your life. You won't just casually stumble into His plan for you. You're going to have to pursue that. John Piper says it this way. He says, until God becomes dominant in our thinking and in our feeling, until He becomes the blazing sun at the center of the solar system of our daily lives, until He becomes the Mount Everest among the foothills of little concerns with this world, until He rests upon our souls and our churches with 10,000 times more weight than politics and church growth. Until then, all our talk about His glory or worship or singing will just be more human engineering of religion, of which the world needs no more. Nehemiah 12 reminds us that resurgence comes when we give thanks and glorify His name. Nehemiah 13 reminds us that we have to continue to walk with Him in faith and obedience, or we will drift away and we will fall into disobedience and we will miss out on the great blessing of serving Him and glorifying His name. We've said in past weeks that Nehemiah points ahead to the coming of Christ. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that even though it's in the middle of our Old Testament, Nehemiah is at the very end of Old Testament history. The story of Nehemiah happens just before the 400 years that happened between the end of Nehemiah's life and the coming of Christ. So the Bible closes out the Old Testament with a servant leader who leaves the king's palace and comes into Jerusalem to restore the people and to make great the name of the Lord. Remember verse 43, chapter 12, God had made them rejoice with great joy. Not just rejoice. They didn't just rejoice. They rejoiced with joy. And not just with joy, but with great joy. And this is one of the last events chronologically in the Old Testament. Now, fast forward 400 years to the beginning of the New Testament. An angel comes to a group of shepherds not very far from the site of Nehemiah's wall, and the angel says, I've got good news. Not just good news, but good news of great joy. And not just good news of great joy, but good news of great joy that will be for all people. And so Matthew writes and says that they went even one step more than Nehemiah's people 400 years earlier who rejoiced with great joy. Matthew says that the shepherds rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And Jesus, the ultimate servant leader, the one to whom Nehemiah points, left the ultimate palace of the ultimate king to come to earth and live among his people, to restore and to redeem and to ultimately sacrifice his life on the cross as payment for sin and to rise again so that we might have life. If you have questions about that tonight, about what it means to turn from the way in which you are going and turn toward Jesus, to accept his death on the cross as the payment for your sin. Don't leave without talking to one of your group leaders or getting in touch with me. Nehemiah asked great things of a great God. And God, Nehemiah's God, our God, he moved for the sake of God's people and the glory of his own name to accomplish what only God could do. And so my prayer for you is that we will see God accomplish in our lives what only he can do. I pray that you have a great time of discussion, that you finish strong this semester, and that you walk with him in faith and obedience.